Hello, everyone. I'm Dorothy Kittner, Associate Dean and Director of Corporate Relations here at WashU Olin's Business School. We welcome you and are thrilled to have you join us today for our Business Research Series presentation by Professor Andrew Knight. This presentation is a webinar, so could you please put your questions into the Q&A chat box? And myself and Julia Garza will be moderating them, and there'll be time at the end for you to ask questions. So please, you can start putting them in the chat box throughout, and if it makes sense, we might try and answer it during the presentation. But with that said, I'd like to introduce you to our Dean, Dean Mark Taylor. He's the Dean of the Olin Business School and the Donald Danforth Jr. Distinguished Professor of Finance. He's one of the most highly cited financial economists in the world. He's an industry expert as a foreign exchange trader, an advisor to the Bank of England and the International Monetary Fund, as well as he was the managing director at BlackRock. He has multiple degrees from Oxford University, Birkbeck College, London University, and Liverpool University. Dean Taylor joined us in December 2016 from Warwick Business School, where he was a professor of finance and dean emeritus there. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous leader, Dean Mark Taylor.
Thank you, Dorothy, and good morning and welcome. I'm really pleased to be here as Dean of Olin Business School. So we have a variety of different guests in attendance today, both friends of Olin, students, alumni, faculty, and staff. So thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. So our business research series is about the practical application of research, about the practical application of the research of some of our outstanding and really world-class faculty, one of whom we're going to hear from this morning. And we really need to share the research of that world-class faculty with the business community. And by coming together and joining research with practice, our aim is to improve business and also to improve feedback to our research. The part of the research you're hearing today is part of a process involved in the Olin Award within the business school. Faculty submit papers to the Olin Award. It's reviewed by a panel of really highly distinguished judges from all sectors in the corporate community, right? The fact that this has to be applicable research that is appreciated by members of industry and the corporate sector. And the best research from amongst those submissions, the best piece of research are chosen to be featured at these business research series, and also on the research page of our website where you can see more details. Now, none of this would be possible without the help, support, the friendship of Dick Mahoney, Mr. Richard Mahoney, who is, of course, Olin's distinguished executive in residence, and of course, the former chief executive officer of Monsanto. And Olin has really benefited tremendously over many, many years from Dick's vision and from his support of the school. He's really made, it really made, and it's no exaggeration, made programs like this possible. In fact, Dick, I like to joke with Dick. We call this the Olin, the Olin Business Award or the Olin Award. It's really the Dick Mahoney Award, but Dick is far too humble to allow us to do that. And Dick has continued to challenge us to find new ways to put a world-class cutting-edge research into the hands of business leaders, and the Business Research Series is really a direct outcome of that. And I should again emphasize the quality of our faculty is inspiring. And part of the bane, if you like, or part of the boon and the bane of a dean's life is looking at various rankings. Business schools get ranked in all sorts of ways nowadays. One rank, the Financial Times recently ranked our MBA as the highest it's ever been, so in the global top 25, in sort of the national top 12 or so. But if you dig down into the Financial Times, they rank us on 22 different criteria, and you can reorder and just rank on those single criteria. And in terms of the quality of research output per capita, so adjusting for size of our faculty, the quality of research output in terms of top journal publications in business school journals. The Financial Times ranked our faculty #1 in the world, right? And if you allow for some errors of bands of errors there, or some kind of adjustment, we're still without doubt one of the top research business schools in the world. And it's very important to us that that research is disseminated to corporate groups like this. And you're going to hear more about this, particularly in Professor Andrew Knight's work this morning. And if you feel that the school can be of greater service to your organization, you'd like to hear more, we can work with you and perhaps share some of our fantastic research with you. And Dorothy Kittner's already spoken, who's the head of our corporate relations. Please feel free to reach out to Dorothy or reach out to me. Okay, so let's go on to talk about our presenter this morning, who is Professor Andrew Knight. Sometimes people describe Andrew as a rising star. I think his star's risen pretty far, right? So Andrew is a rising star whose star carries on rising. I'm delighted to say he's a professor of organizational behavior here at Olin, and also the associate dean of Washington University at Brookings Experience Initiative, and the academic director of our lifelong learning. Andrew's areas of expertise are entrepreneurship, leadership, team development, and diversity. And his work covers virtual work, people analytics, collaboration, and relationships. Andrew received his PhD in managerial science and applied economics from the Wharton School. We don't hold that against him. And he also holds a master's in organizational psychology from the University of Maryland. So without further ado, Professor Andrew Knight, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Taylor, for the kind introduction. And I want to begin this morning by also echoing the comments that Dean Taylor made in gratitude to Dick Mahoney for sponsoring the Olin Award. Each year when the Olin Award comes along, it is a terrific prompt and push to think critically about how we can best communicate and translate the findings of our research into a language that might resonate with folks in a broad array of organizations. I'd also like to take a moment here and recognize and thank the team of staff that works hard behind the scenes on the Olin Award. As Dean Taylor mentioned, there is a terrific team of folks who come together to evaluate the proposals. And further, there are a team of staff who work very hard to coordinate the process, as well as put on these kinds of events that serve as good venues for faculty to share their research. The specific research that I'm going to be sharing with you today is currently in press at the Academy of Management Journal. And the focus of the work is on coordination in multi-team systems. And this project itself was a multi-team effort involving collaborators across multiple universities, multiple schools within those universities, as well as benefiting from the generous support of Lockheed Martin. I'm going to take some time here this morning to share some of the principal findings of this research with you in a way that I hope translates the importance of the findings for work that you might be doing. And so I want to start in our time today by sharing with you a story that illustrates some of the challenges and opportunities of what are called multi-team systems. And the story that I'll share with you is the story of the Mars Climate Orbiter, which was part of a broader mission program of NASA's to engage in exploration of Mars. And it specifically was part of the mission in 1998 to conduct surveillance on Mars. And its primary purpose for this component, the Mars Climate Orbiter, was specifically to study the climate and the atmosphere of Mars, in part in preparation for the Mars Polar Lander, which would eventually, hopefully, land on Mars to explore the surface. This particular spacecraft, the Mars Climate Orbiter, was launched in December of 1998. And the organization behind it is a very good example of what researchers call multi-team systems. In short, a multi-team system is a team of teams. It looks like many companies. It looks like many cross-functional organizations. But the key distinction is that a multi-team system is typically project-based. And so it's brought together with a pretty focused set of objectives, a clear time frame for which it will be in action, and then these multi-team systems typically disband upon the completion of their objectives. I'm going to simplify the Mars Climate Orbiter multi-team system a bit, but I just want to give a description of what some of the elements were behind this effort. First, there was a spacecraft development team. And this was an effort that NASA subcontracted to Lockheed Martin. And so Lockheed Martin was the spacecraft development team charged with designing and developing the actual spacecraft itself. And so the hardware as well as the software of that spacecraft, and supporting throughout its mission, providing support just like you might get support for, the car that a car company has built for you. The second component that I'll describe is the spacecraft operations team. And this is a NASA team out of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And the spacecraft operations team was, in some sense, in charge of driving the spacecraft to Mars, in charge of operating the different components throughout its mission, conducting the scientific efforts once the spacecraft reached Mars. And then finally, there was a project management team as well, a NASA effort. And the purpose of that team, its principal objective, was to make sure that the project actually advanced according to its timetable, as well as connect the climate orbiter component to the broader mission of Mars Surveillance 98. Now, what you'll see is that each of these teams is a bounded team. Each team has its own performance objectives. Each has its own metrics of success, its own specific timetable. However, this team of teams also has an overarching set of objectives that unite the teams together, that bring them together in pursuit of a common objective. And so that's what a multi-team system looks like. It's a team of teams that's in pursuit of an overarching objective, but each component team has its own well-defined objectives as well. And so for nearly 10 months, the Mars Climate Orbiter traveled through space from Earth to Mars, and it arrived close to Mars in September of 1999 and began the process of insertion into the orbit of Mars. During insertion, the orbiter was lost. And this was surprising for the team of teams, each component of the team of teams, that the Mars Climate Orbiter was lost. And it presented an immediate problem for NASA, as well as its component organizations, because just behind the climate orbiter was the polar lander, already traveling through space. And so NASA quickly initiated a post-mortem investigation to figure out what had gone wrong with the climate orbiter so that they could take steps and act very quickly to make sure the same thing might not happen with the polar lander. And so here's what they found, in part. What they found in their investigation is that they had expected the trajectory of this orbiter to enter Mars orbit at about 226 kilometers above the surface. But in their post-mortem, what they discovered is that the actual trajectory of the spacecraft indicated that it was probably only 56 kilometers above the surface of Mars. And at that altitude, the spacecraft either was destroyed in the Martian atmosphere or it skipped off into space. Now, the post-mortem investigation further revealed the root cause of this discrepancy between the actual altitude and the estimated altitude. The spacecraft development team that had built the hardware and developed the software had programmed into a key component of the software using values in the imperial system. And so specifically, they used values of pounds force seconds, whereas the spacecraft operations team was expecting and making adjustments to the navigation of the spacecraft using the metric system and using Newton seconds. The difference between these is a factor of about 4.5. And so again, as you think about the discrepancy, 226 kilometers is just a smidge over 4 times greater than 56 kilometers above the surface. And so all along the way through that 9-month journey, the operations team had been making small adjustments to the trajectory, but we're using a different scale than what the spacecraft development team had used. What was the price tag of this breakdown in coordination in this multi-team system? Somewhere around $330 million for the orbiter, but also the loss of the valuable data that could have contributed to the Mars Polar Lander, which also failed to achieve its objectives at an additional cost of about $165 million. And so this coordination breakdown that occurred in the Mars Climate Orbiter is a very good example of what often happens in multi-team systems. And so despite their many strengths, assembling groups of highly specialized units in order to tackle very complex problems, in spite of those strengths, research shows that multi-team systems are also vulnerable to breakdowns in coordination. And these breakdowns in coordination arise from what is an inherent tension in this design of an organization. On the one hand, you have people organized into these bounded local teams. And these teams are differentiated in several different ways. However, for the system to succeed, those teams have to integrate their efforts in pursuit of a more distant system-level set of objectives. And so coordination tensions can arise as a function of this valuable differentiation that's accompanied by some challenges when it comes to integrating the work of different teams. Specific places where you see this in multi-team systems, whether those are teams coming together to design new software platforms, teams coming together to design new medical hardware to be used in hospitals and healthcare systems. These different component teams often have distinct goals, values, and priorities. They also tend to develop sub-identities. People feel an identification with their local team, sometimes more so than the overarching system. That can give rise to distinct norms, different languages that are spoken across these different clusters in a multi-team system. And what you observe, certainly in the Mars Climate Orbiter example, is the emergence of different standards and practices that are sometimes in conflict across the different units of the multi-team system. And so, as a consequence of this differentiation and integration, sometimes really high levels of cohesion and coordination within teams, something that team development folks often really strive for. Sometimes that high cohesion and coordination within teams creates barriers to effective coordination across teams. And coordination is necessary for organizations of all sizes. It, in some ways, is the basic ingredient to organizing. Researchers who study coordination often categorize the ways that we achieve coordinated activity, the integration of different actions together, into formal mechanisms and informal mechanisms. And so as you think about your own organization that you're a part of and reflect on how people bring their work together, some of the mechanisms that guide those efforts are formal. They are impersonal. They're typically instituted top-down. They are often set out in advance of the commencement of work. And so you see these in all of the quintessential elements of a bureaucracy. Structure, formal structure and roles. Planning in advance. Training programs that prescribe best practices for how to accomplish work. Those are all examples of formal mechanisms of coordination. However, we also use, on an ongoing basis, informal means of integrating our activities together. Informal mechanisms of coordination tend to be more personalized. And so they are direct contacts and interactions between people. They often emerge bottom up as people are going about their daily work. And so they're more organic to the conduct of work as it's in practice. You see informal coordination happening in those ad hoc conversations, chat messages, a quick question or suggestion that's sent to a colleague or coworker that helps bring work more tightly into alignment. Now, in prior research on coordination within multi-team systems, it is abundantly clear that these complex operations require formal mechanisms of coordination. We have to have clear roles, we have to have clear objectives, we have to have clear plans and practices to bring work together. Prior research, though, is far more ambiguous about the value and worth of informal coordination within multi-team systems. And so, as you think about the question for us that motivated our research, revolved around whether informal coordination would help or hinder the conduct of multi-team systems. Just to give you a flavor of some of the different views on this question, some researchers have written that informal coordination is actually detrimental to the performance of multi-team systems because of their complexity. That informal coordination would drive people apart. It would lead to confusion across the system. Other folks, for example, the team of experts that NASA assembled to do the postmortem on the climate orbiter, see things differently. And one of their recommendations was that in going forward, these multi-team systems should increase the use of both formal and informal communication so that people are more tightly aligned in their work. And so this is the basic question that we set out to study in our research. Does informal coordination help or harm the performance of multi-team systems? We studied this question in a unique context. We studied this within the context of engineering multi-team systems. And specifically, our research context was a university engineering course. This particular course was highly experiential. It was project-based learning in which students actually constructed things in order to apply engineering principles that they were learning. And the course took place over 11 weeks. Our sample in this study was 44 multi-team systems. And so 44 systems that were engaged in the exact same set of task requirements. And this involved the work of 295 teams and 930 people. Now, specifically what these folks were doing, they were building Rube Goldberg machines. And a Rube Goldberg machine is an over-engineered, overly complex machine that is designed to accomplish a relatively trivial, mundane, or simple task. And so in this course, students had to work in multi-team systems in order to design a machine that would transfer energy from one place all the way through the machine to a final outcome of depositing sugar into a coffee cup. For this particular machine, as an engineering course, as you might imagine, there were a set of requirements that teams had to follow. And because they were using this exercise in order to apply engineering principles, they had to do several things within the machine. What this graph shows you is what a typical schematic for a machine might look like. Each of the pink rectangles that you see represents one team's component of the machine. And so each team had to design its own subcomponent that would transfer energy 6 times. And so a typical transfer of energy might be when a marble rolls into a set of dominoes, knocking those over, which triggers the release of a helium balloon. And so each team had to transfer energy 6 times. However, each team also had to transfer energy between their machine and other teams within the system. And so team 1's output would serve as the input to team 2, which the team 2's output serve as the input to team 3, so on and so forth, until team 8 would deposit sugar into the coffee cup. Now, for this project, students were physically co-located in space, and so they occupied a typical laboratory space for 2 hours per week over the course of 11 weeks. And just to give you a sense of what their task objective was, I'll share with you a snippet of a video of one of these machines in action. Now, as you watch this video play, what I want to draw your attention to are times when you see humans intervening in the machine, because those are important indicators of the performance or the quality of the machine. So as you see, the machine begins. That is one specific team on the white rectangle. Now we've transferred to a second team. Things are moving along fairly well. Energy is being transferred from one team to the next across these events until the machine stops. Someone has to physically intervene, and then the machine continues. And so that physical intervention, each time you see that happen, that represents a defect in the machine. And so the key performance metrics here, as you think about what would indicate success of this multi-team system. First, we can think about the success of any individual component team. And so each team had to transfer energy at least 6 times. And so one question is, how successful were they in transferring energy within their own team? However, we can also think about the success of the system, which is the efficacy of teams in transferring energy from one team to the next. And so here, this is the proportion of successful transfers that they were able to accomplish. Now, as you translate this fairly stylized classroom example into the real world, you can think about the reliability of a machine. You can think about the error rate of software, the prevalence of bugs that arise. These metrics are fundamentally an assessment of the reliability of the machine that these students engineered. We relied on data to study informal coordination in this project, data from 3 sources. We collected web-based surveys where we solicited the perceptions of the students about the functioning of their teams and their systems. We also collected data from trained human observers. And finally, we gathered data using wearable sensors. And so let me take just a moment and describe these particular sensors that we asked students to wear whenever they were in their class, so for that 2 hours each week over the course of 11 weeks. These devices house several instruments. We use them specifically to understand patterns of interpersonal interactions. So times when people were in consultation or conversation with others in the classroom. And specifically, we measured this using indications of physical proximity. And so in our research context, as people sought to coordinate with others in their team as well as others across the system, they would physically move throughout the room to get closer to them. And so we use these devices as measures of 2 focal points of informal coordination. The first focal point of informal coordination is coordination between teams. And so we measured using these devices how often people spent time with the members of teams that were not their own. And so these blue connections, reflect coordination across different teams. The second focal point of coordination that we studied was coordination within teams. And so how often did people spend in interactions with just the members of their own team? Now, we assessed these different foci of informal coordination because they fundamentally capture that tension that I highlighted at the start within multi-team systems. A tension between maximizing the efficacy and coordination of your own team versus seeking to maximize the efficacy of the system as a whole in your coordination with the members of other teams. And so these sensors enabled us to see over the course of time how teams as well as systems differed in how siloed they were. And so the graph that you see here shows connections between the members of a multi-team system. And what you can see here is that this is fairly siloed. there are these limited connections, fairly brittle bridges between the different teams of this system. And using the devices, we could assess how siloed interactions were. And so what you observed is that some teams were quite densely connected, some systems were quite densely connected, others tended to be more sparse in their connections across teams. And so integrating these sensor-based metrics with our survey data, as well as the data from our trained observers, I'm going to highlight some of the key things that we learned about informal coordination within multi-team systems. And I'm going to focus first on team performance. And so as we think about these different levels of objectives that exist within a multi-team system, we can ask first, do the teams within the system achieve their objectives? In the Mars Climate Orbiter example, did the spacecraft development team build a good spaceship on its own? Was it a functioning and effective spacecraft? And so what we learned in our research is that informal coordination with other teams, so spending time connecting with others outside your own team, can actually hurt your own team's performance. It can undermine coordination within your own team. And specifically what we found is that team conflict, people's disagreements about how they should be doing their work, their ideas about what they should be accomplishing within their team, we observed that team conflict increased as people spent a disproportionate time with the members of other teams compared to their own team. Specifically, a 1 unit increase in conflict, which in this context was just about a standard deviation, a 1 unit increase in conflict was associated with a 2% increase in a team's own internal failure rate. Now, a 2% defect rate for an engineered machine is highly, highly problematic. And so what this means is that a very well-meaning intention to improve system coordination by informally communicating and coordinating with others can actually undermine your own team's performance. There is no free lunch. Enhanced inter-team coordination, interacting with others outside your own, does come at the price of poorer local component team performance if people aren't devoting specific attention to their own team's work. Now, let's consider system performance. What we observed here is that informal coordination can help a system if and only if there is balance, and specifically balance between efforts to coordinate within component teams and efforts to coordinate across component teams. Specifically, what we found is that systems where inter-team and intra-team coordination were highly imbalanced had twice the failure rate of teams that were balanced in these forms of interactions. And so our findings here underscore this high wire that the members of a multi-team system face. Too much time spent focused on just your own team. If you try to maximize your own team's performance, this is going to undermine the functioning of the system as a whole. But too much time spent interacting with the members of other teams to hopefully coordinate across the system can undermine your own team's performance and consequently undermine the functioning of the system as a whole. And so what would the implications of these findings be for managing something like the multi-team system responsible for the Mars Climate Orbiter? If you'll recall at the start, I highlighted that the conclusions of the investigation team in the postmortem of the Mars Climate Orbiter failure, the key conclusion that they reached was that there was a need to increase communication, increase formal as well as informal communication and coordination among all elements of the system. Our research suggests that this is partly right, but this guidance should be more nuanced. And so our research would suggest instead the following pieces of guidance for managing multi-team systems. First and foremost, our findings do undermine the conclusions of past researchers who have made strong statements that informal coordination will hurt multi-team system performance. We did not find that at all. Instead, our findings indicate that informal efforts to coordinate can actually help multi-team systems that are engaged in knowledge work. However, it's not as simple as just increasing the volume of communication or the volume of coordination between teams, as NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter report suggested. More is not necessarily better. We have to think about more than just volume of coordination. We also have to think about how that volume is distributed across the different elements of the system. Our findings specifically indicate that managers should push multi-team systems to strike a balance between how much time they spend within their own teams, trying to coordinate informally and adjust their activities to maximize their team's performance, and their efforts to coordinate with the members of other teams in the system to make sure that all of the parts of this complex organizational form are in alignment. And so, how might managers do this today? How might you do this today if you happen to manage a multi-team system? How could you put this in practice within your own organization? Just like managers routinely document the formal structure of their organizations, so too can they keep an eye on the informal structure, the informal patterns of communication and coordination across people. In particular, modern digital trace data, how people are communicating through electronic media, for example. Modern digital trace data can provide the means, especially in a world of a shift towards virtual work, to keep an eye on the ways that people are informally communicating with one another. As just one example, consider some data that was recently reported in Microsoft's 2021 Work Trend Index annual report. As part of this effort, Microsoft analyzed billions of communications between people in organizations through Microsoft Teams as well as Microsoft Outlook. And what they observed was that as people shifted into virtual work, there was actually a flip in the balance of how people were communicating with the members of their organization, such that after the shift to virtual work, people became increasingly siloed, communicating only with the members of their own teams, rather than communicating in a more distributed fashion across other parts of their organizations. And so I raise this example to close because I think it shines a light on how the software that exists in almost every organization today can provide this exact same metrics that we used wearable sensors to collect in our research to give managers insight into the level of balance between people's communications with their immediate, most proximal local team members versus the other components of their organization that they need to coordinate closely with. And hopefully, in doing so, you can avoid some of the costly breakdowns in coordination that compromised the Mars Climate Orbiter project. I will now look forward to your questions, insights, comments in the time that we have remaining.
Yeah, I believe there's a question for you in the chat from your colleague, Professor Sitharaman.
Okay, the question is, I'm presuming it's what if inter-team coordination is not observable? And so that is where I think there is value in leveraging some of the digital trace data that we often have in organizations. Now, inevitably, this brings up some tensions with people's often correct distaste for having their work monitored. However, just like we did in our research, it's important to highlight that the eventual metrics that we used to study coordination were aggregate metrics. And so we weren't looking at the end of the day at identified patterns of communication and coordination. Instead, we were studying on aggregate, to what extent was a system relatively siloed or not. And so similarly, using some of the analytics that are possible with with our digital platforms, I think that is how we might infer about how people are coordinating with one another on an informal basis. Now, of course, we will have inevitable blind spots in this. Just as you imagine your coordination efforts with your colleagues, sometimes you use devices and platforms that your organization is privy to, and sometimes you may use devices, platforms, and pieces of software that are outside that ecosystem. However, I would argue that some is better than nothing, and so just training an eye on some of those digital data streams, I think, could be one path forward.
There's a couple questions coming in. Anne Elliott. Yeah.
Okay, question is, how can we overcome barriers to collaboration while working from home? Anne, thank you very much for the question. It's a great question, and it is really specifically something that Microsoft's Work Trend annual report highlighted some of the barriers that have emerged through virtual work, especially for coordinating with people who are outside of the rhythms of your everyday work. And so as you think about the contrast between working physically co-located compared to having people work remotely, one of the primary shifts that occurs is that people's contacts tend to become highly operational. And so as you imagine your interaction patterns, they're often revolving around the most proximal work that you have, the projects that you're working on. In contrast, when you're working in a physically co-located space, you run into people serendipitously from across parts of your organization, and you have those hallway moments and small conversations just because you happened to be in physical space at the same time. And so one recommendation that arises from research on virtual work is that you have to be more conscious and proactive in actually creating those opportunities to connect with people outside of your ordinary streams of work. And so it requires more effort. It requires more effort in order to actually create that time, schedule those moments with people outside of your normal patterns of work just to catch up. And make sure that you have some visibility into pieces of your organization's operations that are outside of your own.
So Professor Sitaraman clarified his question. He said, my question is not about the logistical aspects about observability. Would your results generalize to the case of unobservable coordination?
So I'm not sure what you mean by unobservable coordination. One distinction that is often made in research on coordination is between explicit coordination and implicit coordination. The distinction being explicit coordination often tends to be a little bit more formal, and it's based on clearly defined rules of engagement, versus implicit coordination, where people are often behaving as a function of assumptions that they're making about others. Now, to the extent that that's what you mean by unobservable, I would imagine that the problem compounds within multi-team systems as people rely increasingly on implicit coordination as the ways of interlinking their activities across the boundaries of different teams. Again, one of the things that happens within multi-team systems is that the different component teams develop their own language, norms, assumptions. They develop their own, assumptions about how to coordinate work together. And so my guess is that the findings of this research, about the importance of being attentive to coordinating within as well as outside and balancing that, that would be even more important if people are not conscious of or aware of the means in which they're coordinating. But I'm not sure if I'm reading the question correctly.
Let's see, we have, I'm not sure if he got back to us. Mr. Mahoney has a question for you as well. How can you monitor a project in process for proper interaction between and among groups? And he says, great presentation, by the way.
So with respect to monitoring things in process, this is precisely where the digital trace data can be valuable. And so if we imagine that Mars Climate Orbiter project on an ongoing basis over time, it would be relatively trivial to create a dashboard that actually shows how siloed the communications are within and between teams in that multi-team system. And so using things like, I don't want to spotlight any particular product, but using any of our cloud-based platforms, you could create a dashboard that displays specifically the patterns of communication, the patterns of meetings that are happening across an organization, again, provided that those are happening within the software platforms that an organization is using. And so I think that is something that would be particularly valuable for an organization, for someone who is charged with leading one of these complex efforts, is to have some visibility into the informal coordination, just like leaders have very strong preferences about the formal coordination, the definition of roles, lines of formal communication, responsibility. And so we can similarly monitor and keep an eye. I would argue it's most valuable at an aggregate level. Keep an eye on the ways that people are communicating and coordinating with one another outside of those formal channels that are prescribed by the organization.
And then we have a question from Erica. Is there a difference between individual team members interacting with other teams, individual members and other full teams, or one whole team's interaction with one other whole team?
Great question, Erica. So the specific way that we assess this, I'll speak first to the measurement side, and then also touch on some of the implications as we think about your question. We measured these interactions actually at the level of a dyad, and so a pair. And so we could observe the times when any two people were within a certain range of physical proximity to one another. And so what that means is that we could observe when there was this cluster of 3 or 4 people from one team together with 3 or 4 people from another team. Now, the distinction here is you might imagine that it would be highly efficient and that it would be strategic for each team to nominate someone to serve as the liaison, the point person to coordinate with the liaison from other teams. And that has been a recommendation from past research on multi-team systems, is that there are coordination benefits to having things flow through this single node in order to coordinate. That would be a good example of formal coordination. We're going to create a role. And so we examined this in some post hoc analyses in our data set, and we did not observe that there were benefits to having communications going through a single person or concentrated within a single person as opposed to having the full group. Now, big caveat here, we were studying what still is a relatively small multi-team system. And so for most of these multi-team systems, there were 24, 28 people within the system. And so still very feasible for 3 or 4 people to meet up with 3 or 4 others. As you imagine a system like the Mars Climate Orbiter, in that context, there may be far more value in having a concentration of those responsibilities to coordinate with other teams going through one person.
So I think this next question is along those lines from Rick, asking, did you study differences in the communication norms across the actual teams, right? Did some teams have more informal communication norms than others? And my added part is, were they more successful, not as successful?
So we didn't study norms per se, but we did study behavior. And so we studied the degree to which people were engaged in informal interactions with themselves. And so again, if we imagine this team working together, there is a path in building out this Rube Goldberg machine where a team could actually divide things up among themselves and go work separately and then come together at some point to put their pieces together. A team could do that. What we found in our research is that when teams did that, especially when they were spending time with other teams rather than their own, they tended to get into significant disagreements with one another. They had increased conflict, and it undermined their performance. And so, yes, we did observe different team level patterns of informal communication, and those different patterns were linked to how effectively the teams coordinated internally with one another and the reliability of their eventual machine.
All right, we have another question from Hassan. Do you see applications of network analysis like this becoming more widely accepted and implemented by business?
The short answer is yes, yes. And so, especially as you think about the emergence of people analytics as a component of human resource management within many organizations, as you think about people analytics within consulting firms as a function, network analysis is specifically one tool that is commonly used to study and understand everything from where coordination breakdowns are happening to also the vulnerabilities of a system if somebody were to leave. And so, imagine that coordination is happening only on an informal basis, and it's all flowing through one person. And if that person decides to quit, we now have a serious problem in our organizational system. And so the short answer is that yes, network analysis is already in use. It has been for quite some time. The main distinction is the availability, especially of digital trace data, to monitor on a real-time basis these patterns of communications and interactions with people within an organization among different teams and different functions and departments.
Another great question. Any hypothesis or observations on how this data might look across different team settings? Example, a large corporation versus a startup, teams made up of diverse people, or maybe teams that are very homogeneous?
So one of the key differences in the setting where we conducted this research that just leaps out to me, where I would love to see a replication of this study in a different context, is that we had people who did operate within a fairly well-structured environment. And so just as you step back and you think about what was required of these folks, they had to show up at a certain time in a certain space with everyone else in their system. Okay, so we had this bounded, physically co-located group. And I would love to see whether our findings would be replicated when we relax that element. I have no reason to think that they wouldn't be. What I think we would observe is there would simply be far fewer informal interactions between people within a system, especially that cross different team boundaries. And so this is an element where, as you again think about your own experience of moving through your organization, when you are all physically co-located, when you're at a large all hands all staff meeting, in that kind of a context, it's very easy to informally coordinate with others. If those aren't happening, though, now it takes more of that conscious, proactive effort to reach out and connect with people. And so that's the primary place where I would be curious to see the replication of these findings. Your question about the size of the organization, similarly. And so as these teams grow, as the systems grow in size, to what extent does informal coordination become perhaps even more valuable for making sure that the people within a team are on the same page, and that each of these different teams is in alignment with respect to the ways that it's approaching its work?
The next question is from Ted Elsas, who loves to suggest your work is very relevant and insightful and important. So thank you for that. So your research is focused on a team working together in one room, which is clearly important. Do you sense there is interest and opportunity to extend your research to highly distributed teams in different places? And I'm curious what you think those results would be. Would they be material different? in that scenario?
Yeah, so connected to the comments that I just made, I would be very interested to see how these dynamics would play out when we remove that requirement that people are physically co-located, and instead we're studying people in a more distributed fashion. And I don't have a reason to expect that things would be different, but I would nonetheless be very curious to see if they were different.
So your colleague, Professor Sitaraman, continues to talk to you. Theranos, you can read that out loud.
Sure. So the question is about Theranos actively and consciously walling teams off from one another. And the other example of this, frankly, is Apple. And so as you think about the distinction between the culture of an organization like Apple and its standard operating procedures compared to a company like Google, Google actively pushes transparency. Apple actively pushes secrecy. And so as you think about coordination within those systems, within Apple, coordination is centralized. And so that system depends on the strength of the central coordination mechanism, the core team at the top, for making sure that work is together and in alignment. In contrast, in a more distributed system, you don't have the dependence on the central node, but on the other hand, you may have a greater risk that people are duplicating work efforts and people are stepping on each other's toes. And so I think there are different paths for coordination, and we see organizations adopting those different paths in a very conscious and strategic manner. No form of coordination will be a panacea. Each has its own limitation. And I think that is, I love to see those different modes of coordination in action because I think they shine a spotlight on the many tools that are available for a manager to make sure that, you know, the pieces are all moving together in a functioning way.
So we're getting close on time, but we have just a couple questions left. Nina Kim provided a really great question. What are your thoughts on how we can avoid overcomplication of multi-team coordination? And I often find our multi-team system on this end of the spectrum. And thanks for your insights, she shares.
So for overcomplicating coordination, this often comes with formal efforts to coordinate. And so as you think about the cliche of a bureaucracy, the cliche is that things start to grind to a halt because there's a form for everything. There's a formal process for every action that someone needs to take. And so just like we could deconstruct some of the pieces of a bureaucracy, I think there's value in asking questions about the value and worth of any individual, formal practice that is in process. The side to that, though, is that if we're relaxing formal elements of coordination, we better be ramping up those informal elements of coordination. And that is likely to be particularly valuable in a smaller team. And so as we expand the size and people don't know one another personally, we often then instead need to rely on some of those formal elements. But I would just think about that trade-off between formal and informal. And as you relax one, you may want to boost up the other.
So, and I think the last question, as he traditionally does, Mr. Mahoney is suggesting opportunities for you to further engage with the audience and seeking if they want to work with you to further your research. So if you want to follow up on that, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll let Andrew have the closing comments.
Sure, thank you very much. And yes, if your organization is one where you observe these kinds of dynamics, I'd love to connect with you and learn about some of the challenges that you face and see if there are some potential opportunities for collaboration down the road. So thank you everyone for joining. I really enjoyed the opportunity to share my work. Thanks again to Dick Mahoney and to the full team behind the Olin Award. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It was fabulous. You all have a great day.